Thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this important conversation tonight. I'm going to speak about a topic that has been the focus of much of my work, really over the past few decades. That makes me sound very old. Girls and young women, and some of the more insidious forms of violence that girls encounter in everyday life. And I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about the lives of girls in this symposium because, surprisingly or not surprisingly, they're often left out of conversations about gender equality. So I'm calling my talk Girlhood's Erased, and my plan is to weave together several ideas that lay the groundwork for understanding how and why violence has been allowed to thrive. I'll share some of my own work and suggest some strategies for a way forward. And in light of current world events, I'm also going to touch briefly on the gendered impacts of a pandemic with particular consideration as to what this means for girls and violence. So how do we erase or invisibilize girls' lives? We do this in many ways. We do it through language, through science, through history, and through culture. And first, language. So when I thought that I was going to be on the Grand Theatre stage in London, Ontario, I was going to begin my talk with an audience participation question. So I have to improvise here. I'll make believe I have a live audience, which I guess I do, but you can't communicate with me. But my question is, who knows the Bengali word for girlhood? And that's a trick question. No one does because there isn't one. Taslima Nasreen wrote a memoir about growing up in Bangladesh, about her journey from birth to adolescence and her later escape to Europe. She explains that there is no precise term in the Bengali language for a female's experience of childhood. The Bengali term for childhood is shelebala, which literally means boy time. So she made up a new word, mayabella, which means girlhood. And I think this omission is really important and speaks volumes about the fate of millions of girls and young women living in societies where females are treated as second-class citizens. Even in places where we have terms for girl and girlhood, we often don't use them. Instead, we more commonly use gender-neutral language such as children and youth and childhood as the privileged categories. And there are two main problems with this. First, it suggests that there is a single experience of childhood, a essentialized notion that allows us to overlook or negate how experiences of childhood or girlhood are shaped by the intersection of different social locations and identities. So the combined effects of gender, race, class, ability, indigeneity, et cetera, in a most basic sense, it implies that there's more sameness than in fact exists. And second, it confuses and obscures the reality of gender-based violence and inequality. I've always found it really interesting how we often speak about women and children. And think about that, women and children. It's almost as though gender doesn't appear or doesn't really have relevance until adulthood. Most of the time, gender-based violence is discussed, it's in relation to women, violence against women or violence against women and children. So we may pay attention to children, particularly those who are witnesses to the abuse of their mothers or those who are abused directly. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't talk about children at all. Absolutely, of course, we should talk about children. But my point is that gender is almost entirely ignored when we're talking about little people. Sometimes we say violence against women and girls, but most of the time girls are left out of the equation. And even when they're mentioned, we don't spend a lot of time unpacking what this means. So I'd like to put the issue in a little bit of a historical context. Although girls throughout the world have historically suffered multiple forms of gendered violence, the challenges that they faced didn't really receive international attention until the 1980s when UNICEF adopted the phrase, the girl child, partly in response to, as you just heard, there are languages where there simply is no term for girl. In 1995, at the United Nations Fourth World Conference on Women in Beijing, the situation faced by girls was highlighted as a significant concern, and the focus was later incorporated into the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, which was ratified by Canada. Specific concerns that were highlighted there were elimination of all forms of discrimination, including negative cultural attitudes and practices against girls, and the eradication of violence against girls. So we began to pay attention, but the impetus for the declaration came initially from women in developing countries, and many questioned its relevance to Canada. and to, I'd say, to North America. I know there are some people from the US on joining us, and I would say that that is equally applicable in Canada or the US. The typical line was that Canada is a champion of human rights and egalitarian gender relations, that we don't have those problems here. And we see this idea being reinforced through international human rights discourses surrounding girls and young women, which is characterized by construction of girls as victims of backward, oppressive, and highly patriarchal cultures. So we typically will speak about the desperate and reluctant victims of female genital mutilation in African countries, or the poverty-stricken child laborers and child brides in India, the undeserving victims of honor killing in the Middle East, and the hungry and illiterate children in Latin America. The unstated premise here is that atrocities inflicted upon girls and young women occur elsewhere, in backward or undeveloped nations, far from the civilized West, and civilized in quotes, and more specifically, far from Canada or the United States. And it's easy to inoculate ourselves with convenient reassurances, but I would argue that these are fundamentally flawed, dangerous, and deeply disturbing. I said before that we also erased girls' lives through science. What's that about? How can that be problematic? And I'm not going to spend a lot of my 12 minutes on this, but very briefly, anyone who has taken a course on child growth and development will have learned various theories about how children grow, the milestones that they're expected to reach at various stages, and how they're expected to find their place in the world. We have Erikson's 8 stages of man, which delineates developmental crises that have to be resolved at each stage in order to be able to move to the next stage from infancy until the end of life. And as described by Erikson, with the exception of infancy, when the developmental task is to achieve a sense of trust, which is grounded in relationship, each successive stage is characterized by increasing degrees of separation and individuation. However, as research by Carol Gilligan and others have shown, interconnections and relationships are typically more important for girls throughout all life stages. So Erikson's theory, the way he describes it, really doesn't speak to the realities of girls' lives. And there are other theories. Lawrence Kohlberg's hierarchy of moral development, which was based on his research with 84 boys, or Piaget's theories of cognitive development, which were based on research with his 3 sons. I could go on and name more, but the point is that we have these theories of child development, which I think are more aptly called theories of male child development, and really theories of white male child development, theories that are devoid of culture and context, without consideration to gender, race, class, ability, and other markers of difference, but that are widely applied as taken for granted facts and assumed to be the way all children grow and thrive. And those who don't follow these patterns are somehow defective. This pattern of erasure shows up again when we talk about violence, and the particular form of violence that I'd like to comment on is sexual harassment, one of the most prevalent forms of violence that girls experience daily. It's violence that's not seen, but carries many of the same harmful effects of more blatant forms of violence. Sexual harassment can take many forms. It can be verbal, physical, visual. It can happen online. It can happen offline. But regardless of the form that it takes, all of it is unwanted. What we learned through our research is that girls encounter sexual harassment on a daily basis, and most often it occurs in highly public spaces, in their communities, their schools, on the buses. That concepts like girls at risk are problematic because all girls are at risk, but it's experienced differently. Most of the harassers are male, and there are a range of physical and emotional adverse consequences. I'm not going to go through all of those here, but a whole range of different impacts. Many of the girls and young women that we talked with told us that although they reported offenses to peers, to teachers, to family members, there was a perception that there were no consequences for the perpetrators. Though the frequency with which it occurs and the lack of intervention by trusted adults, the preference for girls to ignore it, to accept it as just the way life is, through all of those behaviors, sexual harassment becomes trivialized, it becomes normalized, and it becomes dismissed. And the underlying message that girls receive is that harassing behaviors are acceptable. In recent years, partly in response, there's been a growing attention to the problem of bullying, and a whole range of anti-bullying programs have been developed that place a strong emphasis on teaching respect. The problem with these programs is that they tend to individualize the issue, and they lump together a whole range of behaviors, including sexual harassment, racism, homophobia, ableism, classism, under this broad category of bullying, rather than naming the problem for what it is. And without naming the problem for what it is and addressing the associated power inequities, we effectively limit our ability to fight, overcome, and resist it. So if there's this perception that it's seemingly harmless behaviors, boys will be boys, why is it so important that we really pay attention to it? And the reality is that sexual harassment is often the first and perhaps most vital entry point into training males to dominate and violate females, and training females to submit to this domination and violation as an inevitable part of the way life is. It's a form of grooming for later violence. It teaches girls that this is what they can expect in the world, and it teaches boys that it's okay. By doing nothing and telling girls to ignore it, we're essentially giving permission to sexually harass, which constitutes permission to go further. And I think that we can look at sexual harassing kinds of behaviors as part of a continuum. The same ideas and attitudes that contribute to sexual harassment in early years underlie more blatant forms of violence in later years. So it shouldn't be all that surprising that many adult women do experience sexual harassment in the workplace. We've been set up to expect it, and it's great that women are beginning to speak out. The Me Too movement has put a spotlight on sexual harassment, but the focus has been primarily on the workplace and always on adult women, and only on a certain group of women. Never has this attention been directed to girls and young women who experience harassment on a daily basis. Now, I'm going to come back to this and share some thoughts about suggestions and strategies, but I just want to shift very briefly to the current situation and consider what it means for girls during a pandemic. I talked about the fact that sexual harassment occurs in highly public places, but girls are also exposed to other forms of violence, and especially in their homes. Two important facts about reported cases of violence that were shared by Statistics Canada. One is that girls ages 17 and younger are most often victimized by a family member. And second, that girls and young women most commonly are victimized on private property, and nearly 2/3 were victimized in their own home. And as I thought about my talk tonight, I did some reading about the gendered impacts of the pandemic. A number of really great articles that spoke about the increased risks for women, especially for women who are forced into quarantine with an abusive partner, the increased risks that come with greater isolation, with financial stress, with fewer opportunities to connect with trusted people, etc. Really important information, but there was nothing about girls. And I think it's just so important that we think about the risks that girls face when we are confined to our homes. For many girls and young women, home is a safe refuge, but for a great many, it's a place of danger. So we really need to extend the conversation to include violence against women and girls, not as an afterthought. Ultimately, if we're going to create safe environments for girls and boys and for men and women, our efforts need to address and include boys. Maintaining a gender analysis as a central feature of anti-violence programming and policies requires that we examine how male power is used, as well as how boys embody it. And it also necessitates that we teach ways in which both boys and girls can unlearn and resist gender inequality in their own lives. So just in conclusion, sexual harassment precludes the possibility that girls and young women can achieve equality in its fullest sense. By failing to acknowledge the problem, we give girls confusing and conflicting messages. On the one hand, they're told that their goals and dreams need no bounds, that their opportunities for success are limitless. At the same time, they're increasingly restricted as they attempt to avoid sexual harassment. Beyond the development and implementation of empowering programs that challenge the root causes of all forms of violence against girls and women, whether we are researchers, academics, artists, activists, or community members, or some combination more likely, We need to simultaneously, actively, and loudly join in the larger political struggle against male dominance and against all forms of gender-based violence. Only then can we really begin to prevent and overcome it and come closer to to achieving gender equality. Thank you.